It took exactly 12 minutes for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to realize she'd brought an Instagram following to a structural finance war. She should have known something was fundamentally wrong the moment she walked onto the CNN stage and saw Senator John Kennedy sitting there with that unsettling smile. The one that looks vaguely paternal until you realize it's the exact expression a lion gets right before it decides dinner has arrived. He had a massive, leather-bound policy binder in front of him, a stack of congressional research documents to his right, and a coffee mug that, in bold, mocking cursive, declared, "The free market provided this." A clear, theatrical prop he'd certainly brought from home just to establish dominance. The town hall, CNN's idea, was titled, "The Great American Debt Divide. Spending, Saving, or Sinking." It was meant to be a showcase, AOC representing the relentless, modern push for massive federal investment and democratic socialist ideals, Kennedy representing a cold, surgical approach to fiscal austerity and the hard limits of Southern conservatism. The audience was a perfectly calibrated cross-section. Half were young, debt-saddled, energized progressives, the other half were older, skeptical business owners and taxpayers who viewed any new spending proposal as a direct threat to their wallets. Jake Tapper, the moderator, looked less like a host and more like an air traffic controller trying to prevent a mid-air collision. The first question was a straightforward inquiry about the burgeoning national debt. AOC launched into her standard, compelling narrative about how debt figures are manipulated by the rich, how investment pays for itself, and how the moral imperative of a society, not archaic financial metrics, should dictate spending. She hit every high note, every point that would instantly trend on X, securing enthusiastic applause from her half of the room. Then Kennedy leaned forward, adjusting his tie, and that unnerving smile spread a little further. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez," he drawled in that slow, Louisiana cadence that managed to be simultaneously polite and utterly dismissive. "That's a deeply philosophical position. But before we get tangled up in philosophy, I wonder if you could clarify a technical point for me. I'm just a simple country constitutionalist. But I'm having trouble with your explanation of our national fiscal reality. Could you do me a favor and define the term, debt to GDP ratio, for me? Just so we can all operate on the same simple math." AOC hesitated. Debt to GDP, the foundational metric, the trap, subtle as a silk thread, had been sprung. Inflation is when prices go up because of corporate greed. The echo of her past economic misstep hung in the air, a silent self-correction. She tried to pivot, recovering her footing. "The debt to GDP ratio," she explained with practiced political ease, "is merely the national debt divided by the gross domestic product, a misleading figure." She insisted, because the U.S. government is not a household, and the metric ignores the future returns on investment. Kennedy did not interrupt. He simply tilted his head, the picture of patient disappointment. "No, ma'am, I didn't ask you what you thought of the ratio, or what philosophical significance you assign to it. I asked you to define the two component parts and, more importantly, explain the economic significance of the ratio's current level. What percentage is considered the critical inflection point for developed nations, beyond which sovereign markets begin to exert punitive pressure? You have a background in economics from a prestigious university. I'm certain you learned about the Reinhardt and Rogoff threshold. The direct call-out to arcane economic literature, the threshold of 90% and its implications for long-term growth, was the first public sign of her complete lack of preparation beyond talking points. AOC stumbled, muttering something about how those studies were controversial, how the data was old, and how the focus should be on the social safety net, not some arbitrary academic number. Kennedy pulled a document from his policy binder. It was a single page, laminated and stark. "I'm not making fun of the social safety net, Representative. I'm simply pointing out that without a stable fiscal foundation, the social safety net becomes a trampoline with holes in it. Here, this is your college transcript. or at least the public-facing section from your internship application. The Freedom of Information Act is a marvelous thing. He held up the page, careful to show it to the camera. I see here you took Introduction to Macroeconomics and, let's see, a single upper-level course, The Political Economy of Post-Colonial Trade. A fascinating subject, I'm sure, but that's barely 3 courses total that touch on structural finance. And your degree, it's actually in economics and international relations, with a clear concentration on the IR side. That seems light for someone proposing the largest federal spending initiative since the New Deal. Doesn't it? Kennedy flipped the page, and in that Introduction to Macroeconomics, the course where you learn about fiscal cliffs, bond yields, and debt to GDP significance, you earned a grade of C+. Ma'am, I got a C+ in constitutional law, but I don't go around proposing to rewrite the entire Bill of Rights based on that shaky understanding. And I certainly wouldn't propose a financial overhaul of the largest economy in the world based on a basic grasp of the prerequisite material. The progressive side of the audience murmured, their applause completely silenced by the methodical, almost clinical dismantling. The conservatives were energized, a wave of low, pleased laughter rippling through their section. So, you took 3 courses, earned a C+ in the most crucial one, and never worked a day in the field of sovereign debt management, the Federal Reserve, or even high-level municipal finance. Instead, you spent your postgraduate years engaging in community organizing and honest work as a bartender, work I respect. But work that doesn't confer expertise in the mechanics of bond issuance and sovereign risk. Kennedy leaned back, allowing the weight of the facts to settle. And now you're proposing to add $10 trillion in new spending. A move that could potentially push our debt to GDP ratio past the point of no return. Respectfully, Representative, I wouldn't trust you to manage the cash flow of a corner bodega based on those credentials. Let alone the $34 trillion debt of the United States. AOC's face was flush, her jaw tight. She attempted to pivot sharply, deploying the ad hominem of political theater. Senator, this is not about my academic record, she retorted. It's a desperate attempt by fiscal conservatives to distract from the reality of human suffering caused by a rigged system. I agree completely, Representative, Kennedy countered, his voice smooth and deceptively gentle. It is absolutely about human suffering. The suffering of the families who get hit hardest by inflation when the government prints too much money. The suffering of future generations who will be forced to pay the interest on the debt you propose to accumulate. And the suffering of a national economy destabilized by policy recommendations from politicians whose fundamental understanding of the underlying mechanics is, shall we say, a bit remedial. The conservative applause was thunderous. Tapper looked desperate to cut to commercial. The first round was over, and it was a bloodbath. The initial premise, that AOC could debate the intricacies of high finance, had been instantly negated by the simple, documented reality of her C+ in macroeconomics. The economic fight had begun, and the gender studies degree was proving a poor shield. CNN went to commercial, the sound of the debate being less a pause and more the frantic scrambling of AOC's staff in the wings. Kennedy, perfectly composed, simply took a calm sip from his free market provided this mug. When they returned, Jake Tapper, visibly shaken, attempted to steer the ship back to safe harbor. Senator Kennedy, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, let's discuss the specifics of her proposed Green Transition Fund, GTF, and its impact on the U.S. economy. Representative, can you tell us how the GTF ensures American jobs and energy independence? AOC seized the opportunity, launching into a rehearsed explanation. The GTF, she declared, was a plan for true economic revitalization, investing trillions into renewables, creating millions of high-paying, unionized jobs, and achieving a complete, sustainable, domestic energy supply chain. It was ambitious, it was necessary, and it represented the moral and economic future of the nation. Kennedy's smile returned, wider and more dangerous than before. That's a lovely vision, Representative. Truly utopian. I love the sound of millions of new jobs. I'm all for it. But before we build this utopia, let's talk about the bricks it will require. Specifically, let's talk about copper. He pulled out a thick, glossy report from his stack, title pages clearly visible to the camera. Commodity Constraints and the Green New Deal, a feasibility study. I asked some metallurgists and commodity economists, the kind of folks who understand the difference between an asset and a liability, to look at the raw material requirements of your GTF. Because, Representative, wind turbines, solar panels, massive battery storage facilities, and high-speed rail tracks aren't made of rhetoric, they're made of metal. Specifically copper. Kennedy proceeded to lay out the data with the devastating precision of a prosecuting attorney detailing an inventory of stolen goods. Your plan requires an estimated 50 million metric tons of new copper over the next 15 years. Just for the electrification component. That's more copper than the United States has ever consumed in its entire history. The global copper supply chain, as it stands, currently produces about 25 million metric tons per year for all global uses, everything from phones to plumbing. He looked directly at the camera. So, folks, here's the math. The entire world produces 25 million tons a year. And the representative's plan for America alone requires 50 million new tons in a little over a decade. Where is this copper coming from? Are we planning to raid the supply of our NATO allies? Are we going to mine it here in the US? AOC, caught completely off guard by the deep dive into basic materials science, tried to deflect. We need to invest in domestic mining and sustainable sourcing, she insisted. Oh, domestic mining, Kennedy chuckled, a slow, theatrical sound. I appreciate the enthusiasm for American industry. Representative, however, the last time a major copper mine was proposed in the U.S., the Resolution Copper Project in Arizona. Guess who led the charge to block it? Citing environmental and indigenous concerns? You did. Representative, your policy position is consistently, mine locally. If I don't have to see it, and only if it doesn't cause any environmental impact, and only if it's not a corporation, and only if it's not capitalism. He pulled out a printout of an old tweet and a press release from AOC's office, showing her public opposition to domestic mining projects. You celebrated blocking new copper supply. And now you're proposing a plan that requires more copper than is physically available. That's not a policy, Representative. That's a paradox. The economic consequence, Kennedy continued, was equally disastrous. Because of this artificial scarcity created by your policies, the price of copper would not just rise, it would likely skyrocket. We would be relying on foreign adversaries like China, which controls the refining and processing of 40% of the world's copper, to supply the raw materials for America's supposed energy independence. Your plan doesn't lead to energy independence, Representative. It leads to commodity dependence on the very nations we are trying to economically outcompete. He looked at her, his pity now palpable. The GTF, as you've written it, Representative, is not a financial plan. It's a global resource allocation fantasy. You've promised millions of jobs in manufacturing and construction without ensuring the physical materials even exist, or that we could extract them without immediately running afoul of your own environmental policy. The result isn't a green transition, it's a massive, inflationary bidding war against the rest of the world for a finite amount of copper, driving up costs for every piece of American infrastructure. From iPhones to hospitals. AOC attempted to argue that technology would evolve, that substitutes would be found. Technology may evolve, Kennedy agreed smoothly, but policy must be based on the reality of current physics and current supply chains. Not the hope of future science. Hope is not a line item in the federal budget, Representative, and when you factor in the cost of that hyper-inflated, foreign-sourced copper, the price tag for your $10 trillion plan instantly doubles. pushing that debt to GDP ratio even closer to the danger zone. You've killed the Amazon jobs in your own district because you didn't understand tax incentives. And now you're going to kill the green transition because you don't understand basic material science and commodity markets. He set the report down gently. You can't build a renewable future if you're fighting your own policies every step of the way just to get the raw materials. And that's before we even talk about lithium, nickel, and cobalt. The audience, particularly the older, business-minded half, was nodding in grim agreement. The GTF was exposed not as a grand strategy, but as a logistical and material impossibility. Tapper, in a state of professional shock, announced a quick break, whispering to a producer that they needed to find a less technical topic. Something about corporate ethics. When they returned, Kennedy was ready. Let's discuss the concept of moral accounting. Representative, you talk a lot about the rich paying their fair share. A righteous and necessary position. I wholeheartedly agree. Everyone should pay what they owe. And no more. So, let's talk about the Met Gala and the $100 question. AOC's expression, still tight from the copper discussion, flashed with alarm. She knew this was coming, but assumed it would be a simple, dismissible smear about wealth and hypocrisy. Kennedy, however, was clearly preparing a structural takedown using the obscure mechanics of the IRS tax code. He pulled out the familiar glossy photos of AOC in her white gown with the bold red slogan, "Tax the Rich." September 2021, an iconic moment of political theater. A powerful statement worn to an event where a single plate costs $35. Now, you claimed, and I accept this for the sake of argument, that the ticket was a loan from the designer, Aurora James. The dress, a custom piece, was supposedly borrowed and returned. Fine, I'm just a simple country lawyer. But I know the IRS doesn't care about rhetoric. The IRS cares about taxable benefit. Kennedy presented two key IRS documents. The first is the IRS definition of a taxable fringe benefit. The second is the rules regarding the fair market value, FMV, of services rendered. He broke it down step by step. Representative, by attending the Met Gala, you were paid in three ways. A. The use of a one-of-a-kind designer gown, with an estimated FMV of $80 for a single night rental. B. The ticket and corresponding access, a $35 value, which conferred immediate, tangible political and celebrity visibility. C. The professional hair, makeup, and styling services, a political event appearance benefit, easily valued at $15. Even if the dress was returned, Kennedy emphasized the benefit of the use, the taxable value of wearing an $80 asset for a night of political signaling. Remains, the IRS treats the use of a high-value asset, even if temporary, as income, sort of like how if your employer loans you a private jet for a weekend getaway, you still pay taxes on the benefit of that flight. He spread the numbers across his legal pad for the camera. We're looking at approximately $130 in untaxed, undisclosed income. And here is your 2021 Congressional Financial Disclosure Form, a document subject to perjury laws. No mention of this six-figure gift or benefit. Representative, nothing. The tax liability on that benefit, at your income bracket, is approximately $45. The silence was deafening. This was no longer about hypocrisy. This was an allegation of a structural violation of the very tax code she was demanding be made stricter. Let me ensure the audience understands this. Representative, Kennedy continued, his voice heavy with performative gravity. You wore a garment demanding that the rich pay their share, while simultaneously, and demonstrably, not paying your own tax obligation on the benefit derived from wearing that garment. You demanded the IRS increase its scrutiny of the wealthy, while apparently needing the IRS to scrutinize your own six-figure untaxed benefit. AOC, visibly flustered, finally found her voice, arguing that the event was for political purposes. a necessary act of protest, and that the designer was a friend. A political protest, representative, is generally conducted on public property, not at a $35 a plate luxury fundraiser. Kennedy countered sharply, and even if it was a political statement, the IRS doesn't have an exemption code for political performance art with luxury accessories. The tax code is blind to your intentions. It cares only about the value received. And as for your designer being a friend, the friendship doesn't negate the monetary value of the benefit received under the law. Unless, of course, you are suggesting that you, a member of Congress, intentionally undervalued a six-figure benefit in your public financial disclosures. He set down his pen. Ma'am, that's not just hypocrisy. That is, by definition, the evasion of tax liability on a non-cash, high-value asset. You preached about tax equity from the mountaintop of extreme privilege. And then, on your way down, you skipped paying the toll. Your brand is predicated on moral superiority and class warfare. But your personal financial disclosure reveals a stunning disregard for the rules that apply to every other working American who has to report all their income. You preach fiscal responsibility for the nation while practicing fiscal ambiguity for yourself. The audience was rapt. This hit AOC where she lived, the intersection of her moral brand and her personal conduct. The Met Gala dress had been a symbol of her political power. Kennedy had meticulously transformed it into an emblem of her financial UN accountability. And here's the final, exquisite irony, Kennedy said, picking up the final document in this section. A memo from a tax compliance firm. My tax attorneys, the real ones, tell me that if you'd simply reported the benefit, paid the taxes, and then used that moment to argue that the tax code needs simplification, you would have had a clean win. Instead, you chose to break the very rules you want to impose on the entire country. That is a policy of rules for thee, but a red carpet loophole for me. The progressive half of the room remained stunned, unable to defend the intersection of the tax the rich slogan and the six-figure untaxed benefit. The narrative of the fighter for the working class had just run headlong into the cold, hard, documented reality of her own tax forms. Tapper, recognizing that the tax issue was a political nuclear strike, mercifully steered the conversation toward job creation and economic development. Senator Kennedy, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, let's discuss the single most visible economic action taken by the representative. The successful prevention of the Amazon HQ2 project in Queens, New York. Representative, please explain why blocking 25,000 jobs was the necessary action for your constituents. AOC, desperate to regain footing on what she considered her policy turf, stood her ground. That deal was corporate theft. She declared passionately, "We refused to give $3 billion in public funds to the richest man in the world." It was a victory against corporate welfare and a stand for community investment over billionaire handouts. Kennedy held up his hand, signaling a pause, that familiar, lethal smile returning. Stop right there, Representative. That single sentence is the conceptual failure that cost your constituents a guaranteed future. Because that sentence reveals not just a philosophical disagreement, but a fundamental, foundational misunderstanding of municipal finance and tax increment financing, TIF, structures. He pulled out a large, color-coded schematic, a financial breakdown of the Amazon deal, detailing the estimated tax revenue flow versus the promised incentives. Let me educate the audience, and perhaps, Representative, on what tax incentives actually are. Because the C+ in macroeconomics clearly failed to cover this. Representative Ocasio-Cortez genuinely believed, and still believes, that New York was going to write a $3 billion check to Jeff Bezos. A physical check that could have been spent on schools, subways, or housing. That is unequivocally false. Kennedy stated flatly, the $3 billion was not a cash payout. It was a package of tax abatements and credits. A promise that Amazon would pay less in future taxes than they would have otherwise. The key fiscal distinction is this: if Amazon doesn't come to Queens, New York receives zero tax revenue from Amazon. If Amazon comes to Queens with the incentives, New York receives $24 billion in tax revenue. He tapped the schematic. The actual economic analysis, conducted by nonpartisan economists, showed Amazon would generate approximately $27 billion in state and city taxes over 10 years, including income, sales, and property taxes. The promised incentives were $3 billion. The net benefit, the actual cash that would have flowed into the city budget for schools, transit, and social programs, was $24 billion. You did not save $3 billion. Representative, you killed a $24 billion revenue stream because you failed to grasp the difference between a cash payment and a tax abatement. Your ignorance of municipal finance cost your city $24 billion actual dollars. But Kennedy was not done with the destruction. He moved on to the second, more devastating component: the job displacement argument. You argued that HQ2 would gentrify the neighborhood and drive out the working class. A valid, if often overused, concern. But let's look at the financial reality of the actual jobs lost. Those 25,000 direct Amazon jobs, he detailed, had an average salary of $150 per year. In New York City, that is not a rich man's salary. That is a solidly upper-middle-class salary for 2 nurses, a firefighter married to a teacher, or a skilled tradesperson. These are the very working families you claim to represent. Now, let's talk about the displacement you supposedly prevented. The neighborhood of Long Island City, where HQ2 was to be built, already had thousands of luxury high-rises. It was already gentrified. Your action didn't stop gentrification. It simply ensured that the new high-paying jobs went elsewhere, leaving the existing working class in Queens with no opportunity to move up, to buy a home, or to stabilize their future income. Kennedy then delivered the coup de grace, pulling out a final map and a set of zoning permits. Here's the true cost. Representative, you didn't stop Amazon. You only stopped Amazon from coming to your district. Amazon still opened facilities in New York City. They opened a major logistics center in Staten Island. They opened offices in Manhattan. And here's the kicker: they built a massive warehouse in the Bronx, right next to your home district. So, what was the net result of your great victory over corporate welfare? Your district got nothing. Your constituents got 0 jobs, 0 tax revenue, and their local businesses lost the massive economic spillover from 25,000 new, high-earning neighbors. Staten Island got the jobs, the Bronx got the jobs, and Queens got your press release. You didn't slay the corporate giant. Representative, you simply moved the feast next door, and your constituents got to watch. You destroyed 25,000 high-paying American jobs in your own district because your understanding of tax policy stopped at a C+ definition. He gathered the documents and looked at Tapper. Representative Ocasio-Cortez thought that opposing the deal was a moral win. It was, in reality, a $24 billion economic suicide motivated by a fundamental misunderstanding of cash flow and tax abatement mechanics. And 25,000 American families paid the price for her policy illiteracy. The debate, which had been titled, "The Great American Debt Divide," had effectively become Senator Kennedy's master class in financial reality. Tapper, bypassing all previous attempts at neutrality, simply opened the next segment with a sigh. Senator Kennedy, let's move to the structural cost of the representative's signature legislation. The Green New Deal, GND. Oh, the wish list, Kennedy murmured, pulling out a slim, well-worn document. I read the GND resolution. It is a work of compelling narrative fiction, but utterly devoid of policy mechanism. It promises universal healthcare, tuition-free college, guaranteed jobs, and rebuilding every single structure in America, all while achieving carbon neutrality in 10 years. It's like promising to fly to Mars on a bicycle powered by good intentions. He presented the audience with 3 different, color-coded economic studies. The American Action Forum, $51 trillion. The Heritage Foundation, $93 trillion. And a liberal-leaning think tank that, even with creative accounting, landed at $42 trillion. Let's settle for a conservative average of $70 trillion over 10 years. That's $7 trillion annually. Now, here is the entire annual federal revenue for 2024, $4.8 trillion. Representative, your plan costs $2.2 trillion more than the entire federal government collects annually, before paying for the military, Social Security, Medicare, or the interest on the current national debt. Where does the additional $6 trillion a year come from? Kennedy demanded, turning the question back to AOC. She launched into the standard progressive response, taxing billionaires, implementing a wealth tax, closing corporate loopholes, and dramatically cutting military spending. Kennedy was ready, dismissing each point with surgical fiscal data. Let's do the basic math. Representative, billionaire wealth tax. The total liquid wealth of every American billionaire, if confiscated entirely and legally, would fund your plan for about 8 months. Then what? Corporate loopholes. Closing every single corporate tax loophole might yield, generously, $150 billion a year. A pittance compared to the $6 trillion shortfall. Military spending. The total defense budget is about $850 billion. Even if you completely eliminated the entire U.S. military, something no serious person proposes, you're still short over $5 trillion a year. The numbers do not work. Representative, your plan requires either raising the income tax on all Americans to 90%, or borrowing so much money that the international bond market would collapse the U.S. economy overnight, causing an economic depression that would make 1929 look like a picnic. You're not funding a transition. You're proposing an inflationary catastrophe. But the money, Kennedy insisted, was not the most ridiculous part. He shifted the focus to the pure, physical logistics of the plan. Let's talk about the logistics of the impossible. Retrofitting 37,000 buildings a day. Your GND promises to retrofit or rebuild every single building in America to meet green standards within 10 years. There are approximately 136 million structures in the United States. That means, mathematically, we would need to complete, certify, and retrofit *** 37,000 buildings per day. Every single day, for 10 years straight, including Christmas, Thanksgiving, and the Super Bowl Sunday. Kennedy pulled out a graph illustrating the number of construction workers in the U.S. versus the demand of the GND. Ma'am, the U.S. construction industry is currently suffering a labor shortage. There are not enough trained, unionized construction workers in the entire country to do this. There is not enough domestic drywall, lumber, or insulation available. You can't train 20 million skilled workers overnight. And you certainly can't mobilize the necessary supply chain. Your plan is logistically absurd. It fails basic scheduling and resource allocation tests. He moved to transportation. You also promised to virtually eliminate air travel and replace it with high-speed rail. The fastest high-speed rail in the world, in China, takes 14 hours to cover the distance between New York and Los Angeles. Who is going to choose a 14-hour train ride over a 5-hour flight for a business trip or a family visit? Furthermore, Kennedy continued, to achieve this, you need to build 30,000 miles of high-speed rail in 10 years. That is 8 miles of brand new, complex, infrastructure-heavy track per day. China, with its authoritarian government, unlimited state power, cheap labor, and no environmental impact reviews, builds approximately 1,000 miles per year. You expect the American system, with local zoning boards, environmental assessments, and union labor requirements, to build 3 times faster than an authoritarian superpower? That's not policy, Representative. That is the mathematics of delusion. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice flat. Your Green New Deal is not a policy proposal. It's an economically illiterate performance piece. You have promised a world that the current physical laws of supply, labor, and finance prevent from existing. You wrote a beautiful wish list, but you failed to show the work on how Santa is going to manufacture, deliver, and pay for the toys. And that is why, despite the rhetoric, your plan is dead on arrival. The progressive side of the audience was silent. The facts too numerous and too technical to argue against. The sheer, documented logistical impossibility of the GND was a far more potent weapon than any simple partisan attack. Tapper, recognizing that the policy debate was a lost cause, pivoted to a softer target, the representative's personal narrative. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, let's discuss the matter of income inequality, a core theme of your political brand. Senator Kennedy, you have referenced the representative's claim to the working class while holding a six-figure salary. Kennedy immediately seized the opening, transforming the personal finance discussion into an examination of false political advertising and lifestyle hypocrisy. When you were elected in 2018, Representative, your financial disclosure showed modest savings, a true representative of the working class. Admirable, but let's look at your current financial status. Representative, you are an elected member of Congress, earning $174 a year, a salary that instantly places you in the top 8% of American earners. You are the rich you constantly talk about taxing. Now, what did that top-tier income buy you? It bought you a car. And not a practical Toyota. Or a modest Honda. It bought you a Tesla Model 3. Visible here in these photos. A luxury electric sedan that retails for over $50. How did someone living paycheck to paycheck suddenly afford a six-figure lifestyle? Kennedy presented the financial trajectory. Your required living expenses are substantial. You maintain a stylish apartment in Washington, D.C.'s Navy Yard, a high-end luxury complex, with rent running upwards of $4 a month. You also maintain a residence in New York. Add in taxes, travel, designer clothing for political events, and personal expenses, and your outlays easily consume your $174 salary. Yet, you went from nearly zero savings to a $50 luxury vehicle in less than 3 years. Where did the money come from, Representative? He pulled out the key document, a breakdown of outside income sources. The money came from the very capitalistic mechanisms you rail against. A lucrative book deal on your working class struggle, and highly paid speaking fees, commanding up to $25 per appearance, to talk about the evils of capitalism. You monetized your poverty narrative to achieve the exact wealth status you spend every day condemning. Here is my point, Representative, Kennedy said, leaning into the camera. You are an economically successful, wealthy individual. You drive a luxury electric car. You live in a luxury complex. You enjoy the benefits of high-income capitalistic success. But you continue to market yourself as the struggling, working-class champion. That is not representation, ma'am. That is false advertising. He then moved to the issue of her housing choices, using it to expose the ultimate hypocrisy of her policy positions on gentrification. Let's talk about the luxury apartment you rent in Navy Yard. It boasts a rooftop pool, a concierge service, a state-of-the-art fitness center, and secured access. It is a new, high-end, luxury development. The exact type of development you have consistently and successfully blocked in your own district in Queens, labeling them instruments of gentrification that displace working families. Kennedy pulled out the comparative documents. In 2019, a similar high-end development was proposed in your district. You rallied against it, arguing it would push out the poor. The project was blocked, yet, you live in the DC equivalent. So, luxury apartments are morally acceptable for you to live in, but morally destructive for your constituents to have built near them. You condemn the existence of luxury housing while actively enjoying its amenities. You want the benefits of a high-security, high-end life without the moral baggage of supporting the building of that life. He concluded with the ultimate condemnation. You cannot simultaneously be the rich person driving the $50 luxury car and the poor person fighting corporate power. You have successfully ascended the ladder of capitalistic success. Representative, congratulations. But when you get to the top, you don't get to pull the ladder up behind you while pretending you're still standing on the ground floor. Your lifestyle speaks volumes, and it shouts, "I am the rich I pretend to fight." The working class in your district rides the subway. Representative, they do not charge their $50 Tesla in the secure parking garage of a $4 a month apartment. The audience, even the younger progressives, could not ignore the documented evidence of the lifestyle gap between the rhetoric and the reality. The illusion of the struggling, every woman politician was shattered by the cold, hard receipts of her own personal expenditure. Tapper gave up all pretense of moderation. The final segment was simply an extended closing argument, a methodical execution by Kennedy on the one group AOC claimed to champion: the small business owner and the working families who depend on them. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Kennedy began, his voice dropping to a serious, almost mournful tone. Let's talk about the backbone of the American economy. The small business owner, the entrepreneur. The couple who took out a second mortgage to open a restaurant. The immigrant family running a grocery store. The people who employ 60% of America. You claim to represent them. Your voting record suggests otherwise. Kennedy produced a detailed analysis of 17 pieces of legislation introduced since 2019 specifically designed for small business relief. Bills focused on tax cuts for businesses with under 50 employees, easing regulatory burdens, and accessing COVID-19 capital. Out of 17 bills targeted at the local bodega, the dry cleaner, and the family restaurant, the core of your community, you voted in favor of only 2. An 11% support rate for the very people who create the jobs in your district. He pulled out specific examples of the devastation wrought by her policy stance. You voted against the extension of the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, that saved millions of small business jobs during the pandemic. You voted against the Small Business Tax Relief Act of 2020. You opposed the easing of regulations that would allow small, independent banks to lend more freely to entrepreneurs. Why? Kennedy demanded. Because you viewed these targeted relief bills as poison pills or corporate giveaways. But Representative, these weren't corporate giveaways to Amazon. They were lifelines to businesses under 50 employees, the very enterprises that distinguish a community from a strip mall. You stood by while, during the pandemic and its aftermath, over 3.400 small businesses in your district permanently closed. You supported the extreme, prolonged lockdown measures, and then you voted against the fiscal lifeboats that could have kept them afloat. The only beneficiaries of this policy? Walmart, Target, and Amazon, the massive corporate chains you claim to oppose. You helped big business crush small business in the name of political purity. He moved to the final, fatal economic proposal: the $15 federal minimum wage with no small business exceptions. You support the $15 minimum wage. Economists across the spectrum, even those on the left, agree that a rigid, non-localized $15 federal mandate will destroy millions of jobs, primarily in the small business sector. Walmart and Amazon can absorb the cost. The local pizza parlor cannot. The independent bookstore cannot. They will automate, they will cut hours, or they will close. Kennedy stood up, the finality of his action emphasizing the gravity of his words. You have never run a business. Representative, you have never met payroll. You have never looked an employee in the eye and told them you couldn't give them a raise because the government mandated a cost increase you couldn't absorb. Yet you vote to make it structurally impossible for the people who do those things to survive. He pointed directly at her. Your father, Representative, was a small business owner, an architect. He understood the risk, the struggle, and the dignity of creating a job. And somehow, his daughter grew up to become the most systematic threat to the survival of the American small business in Congress. You came here tonight to debate economics. But you cannot debate something you fundamentally do not understand. You got a C+ in Econ 101 and decided you were qualified to redesign the global economy. You killed 25,000 jobs in your own district because you don't understand tax incentives. You proposed a $93 trillion fantasy because you don't understand commodity markets. You live like the rich while claiming to represent the poor. And you have systematically voted to destroy the small businesses that actually employ the working class. Kennedy collected his documents, finished his coffee, and addressed the audience with quiet finality. Representative Ocasio-Cortez is not a representative of sound policy. She is an influencer who stumbled into power with a Twitter following and a profound lack of economic literacy. Ma'am, respectfully, you are out of your depth. Stick to social media. Leave policy to the people who understand the math, the markets, and the crushing logistics of reality. The room erupted. The systematic, fact-based destruction was complete. The debate had ended, not with a partisan squabble, but with a public, documented execution of a political brand built on economic illiteracy. The C+ in macroeconomics had finally come due, and the price was her political credibility.